Everyone in the meeting feared the arrogant millionaire, until the cleaner said something that left everyone shocked. The morning fog clung to San Francisco like a shroud, swirling around the steel and glass towers that pierced the sky with surgical precision. From the 40th floor, the city looked like a circuit board, orderly, predictable, controllable. Richard Blackstone pressed his palm against the bulletproof window, feeling the cold seep through the glass and into his bones. Below, tiny figures scurried along the sidewalks like ants following invisible trails, each one believing their individual struggles mattered in the grand design. But Richard knew better. He had learned, through years of climbing over the wreckage of weaker men's dreams, that only the apex predators survived, and TechVision Corp was his domain. A $12 billion empire built on the simple principle that sentiment was the enemy of progress. The Italian leather of his chair whispered as he settled behind the Brazilian mahogany desk that had cost more than most people earned in a year. The morning light caught the platinum cufflinks at his wrists, each one engraved with the Celtic knot his father had sketched on a napkin the night before he died, back when Richard still believed in things like legacy and honor. "Promise me something, boy," his father's voice echoed across the years, thick with the Irish brogue that poverty had never quite beaten out of him. "When you make it, and you will make it, don't become one of them bastards who forgets where he came from." Sean O'Sullivan had died believing his son would be different. He'd died clutching that naive faith that money couldn't corrupt a man's soul if his heart stayed true. Richard almost smiled at the memory. Almost. The intercom's sharp buzz sliced through his reverie. "Mr. Blackstone, the board is on line 2. Margaret's voice carried that carefully neutral tone she'd perfected after watching 5 previous assistants flee his employ. Smart woman. She'd learned to keep her emotions locked away. Just as he had, Richard's finger hovered over the button. He already knew what Harrison Whitfield would tell him. The quarterly numbers had been disappointing in corporate speak. That meant heads would roll, and someone had to swing the axe. The question was whether Richard would be the executioner or join the condemned. "Put them through." Whitfield's voice filled the office like poison gas. Smooth, refined, and utterly lethal. "Richard, we need to discuss your performance metrics. 18% growth, Harrison. Above industry average. In a market that expanded 25%. The pause stretched like a taut wire. "The board has concerns about operational efficiency." Richard's grip tightened on the receiver. Operational efficiency. Such a clean phrase for such a dirty business. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you. 40% reduction in operational costs. You have 30 days. The words hit him like a physical blow. 40% wasn't trimming fat. It was amputating limbs. 400 families. 400 mortgage payments. College funds. Medical bills. Dreams. All reduced to line items on a spreadsheet. That's not a reduction, Harrison. That's a massacre. That's business." Whitfield's voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Either you do it, or we find someone who will. Your choice, Richard. But choose quickly. The clock is ticking." The line went dead, leaving Richard alone with the echo of his own breathing. He stood slowly, each movement deliberate, controlled. Through the window, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the city in sharp, unforgiving detail. Somewhere in those streets below, his father had scrubbed office floors until his knees gave out. Somewhere down there, his mother had cleaned other people's messes, while her own dreams withered like flowers in winter. He'd sworn he'd never be like them. The weak, the powerless, the expendable. But he'd also sworn he'd never become the men who had ground his parents into dust with their indifference. Now he was about to become both. The photograph on his desk mocked him with its frozen optimism. 6 young faces grinning at the camera in a Palo Alto garage 15 years ago. The founding team of TechVision Corp. Back when they believed technology could save the world. 3 of them had walked away when the company's soul started dying. 2 had been restructured when their consciences became inconvenient. Only Richard remained, the last survivor of their shared innocence. His reflection in the window showed a stranger, a man in a $3,000 suit, whose eyes had learned to calculate human worth in dollars and cents. When had Patrick O'Sullivan died? Was it the first time he'd fired someone for sport? The first time he'd crushed a competitor without mercy? Or had it been a slower death, each compromise a tiny cut until the boy from Oakland bled out entirely? A soft knock interrupted his dark meditation. "Mr. Blackstone, Mrs. Walsh and Mr. Chen are here for the 9:30 meeting. Jennifer Walsh, 35 years old, Stanford MBA, and still naive enough to believe that human resources meant treating humans as more than resources. She'd fight him on this, try to find alternatives, propose payment cuts for executives instead of layoffs for workers. She'd make him remember why he'd once cared about such things. David Chen would be different. The CFO understood numbers the way poets understood words, as tools to create beautiful lies. David would have the lists ready, sorted by salary, performance metrics, and dispensability. He'd make the whole process seem inevitable, mathematical, clean. Send them in. Richard straightened his tie, silk, hand-woven in Milan, and arranged his features into the mask of absolute authority he'd worn so long it had fused with his skin. When the door opened, he was no longer Patrick O'Sullivan's son. Wrestling with his conscience, he was Richard Blackstone, CEO of TechVision Corp., a man who could end careers with a signature and sleep soundly afterward. Jennifer entered first, her professional smile not quite hiding the worry lines around her eyes. She'd heard the rumors, felt the shifting currents that preceded every corporate earthquake. Behind her, David clutched his tablet like a life preserver, the glow of spreadsheets reflecting off his glasses. "Good morning," Richard said, his voice steady as granite. "I trust you both understand the gravity of today's discussion." Jennifer's smile faltered. David's grip on his tablet tightened. Outside, the fog continued its retreat, exposing the city in all its brutal clarity, and 40 floors below, in the building's depths where shadows gathered like secrets. A woman named Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart through empty hallways, humming an old song her grandmother had taught her in El Salvador. She had no idea that her 20 years of invisible service were about to collide with the empire of glass above, or that her voice, so long silenced by respect and necessity, would soon shake the foundations of everything Richard Blackstone had built. The meeting was about to begin, and with it, a reckoning that none of them saw coming. The elevator descended through the building's spine like a slow-moving confession, carrying Maria Santos deeper into the belly of the glass giant she had served faithfully for 20 years. Each floor that passed, 39, 38, 37, marked another layer of corporate hierarchy she would never penetrate. Worlds within worlds where decisions were made that would ripple down to touch lives like hers. At 58, Maria's hands bore the geography of hard work, calluses mapping decades of scrubbing, cleaning, and polishing the dreams of others. Her uniform, pressed with the same care she applied to everything in her life, hung loose on her small frame, a testament to the meals she'd skipped to ensure her 3 children never went hungry. The name tag pinned above her heart read simply, Maria, as if her last name, her story, her struggles were unnecessary details in the grand corporate narrative. The basement level greeted her with its familiar symphony of mechanical sounds, the whisper of the ventilation system, the distant hum of servers processing endless streams of data, the soft swoosh of her cartwheels against polished concrete. This was her kingdom, a realm of shadows and service where she moved like a ghost, invisible to those who mattered, essential to the functioning of everything above. Maria began her rounds with the ritualistic precision of a priest conducting mass. Each motion was deliberate, reverent almost. She understood that cleanliness wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about dignity. Every surface she touched, every wastebasket she emptied, every floor she mopped was a small act of care in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. The executive floor's trash told stories the executives themselves had forgotten, discarded business cards from partnerships that never materialized, crumpled memos about innovations that would change the world but never left the drawing board, empty bottles of prescription medications that spoke of stress eating away at the human machinery that powered corporate success. But tonight felt different. As Maria navigated the maze of cubicles on the 35th floor, she noticed the tension hanging in the air like incense, thick, cloying, impossible to ignore. Conversation stopped when she approached, only to resume in hushed whispers after she passed. She'd seen this before. During the last restructuring 5 years ago, when fear moved through the building like a virus, infecting everyone it touched, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, spoken in the gentle cadence of Spanish that had been her first language. Los que limpian las casas conocen todos los secretos, mija, pero los secretos no nos pertenecen. Those who clean houses know all the secrets, but the secrets don't belong to us. Maria had lived by those words, collecting the fragments of other people's lives while keeping her own carefully contained. She knew about David Chen's divorce papers, hidden beneath quarterly reports. She knew about Jennifer Walsh's fertility treatments, Evident from the appointment cards that occasionally found their way into her wastebasket, she knew about Richard Blackstone's sleepless nights, betrayed by the empty coffee cups that multiplied on his desk like accusations. But knowing and caring were different territories entirely, and Maria had built careful walls between them, until tonight, the 41st floor was her final stop, the executive level where the air itself seemed more expensive. As she entered Richard's outer office, something caught her eye, a familiar logo on papers scattered near Margaret's desk, Tech Vision Corp letterhead, but not the usual memos or meeting notes. These were different, denser, more serious. Maria's English had improved dramatically over the decades, shaped by night classes paid for with overtime wages and practiced during her children's homework sessions. She could read well enough to understand what made her stomach clench with sudden dread. Confidential. Workforce Reduction Initiative. Phase 1. Immediate termination. 400 positions. Effective within 30 days. The paper trembled in her hands as names began to leap from the pages like old friends calling out in distress. Roberto Jimenez from maintenance, the young man who sent half his paycheck to his mother in Guatemala. Linda Thompson from accounting, the single mother who worked extra shifts to pay for her daughter's speech therapy. Marcus Washington from it, barely 25, saving every penny for his wedding next spring. Each name was a life, a family, a collection of dreams and responsibilities that would be severed with corporate efficiency. Maria sank into Margaret's chair, her legs suddenly unable to support the weight of this knowledge. She'd cleaned these offices for 2 decades, watched young faces age into resignation, witnessed ambition slowly drain from eyes that had once blazed with possibility. But this felt different, final. Her mind drifted to her own children. Carmen, now a nurse at UCSF, whose college tuition had been paid 1 overtime shift at a time. Miguel, studying engineering at Berkeley, believing that education was the key to breaking generational cycles, and little Sophia, just graduated from high school, dreams intact and future bright with possibility. Each of them existed because Maria had been invisible enough to keep this job, reliable enough to be trusted, quiet enough to be forgotten. She'd watched Richard Blackstone transform from the desperate young man she'd found sleeping in his office 15 years ago, exhausted, broke, but burning with the kind of idealism that could light up the darkness. She remembered that night with crystalline clarity, finding him curled on the old couch in what was then a shared workspace. Surviving on vending machine coffee and determination, he'd been embarrassed when she discovered him, mumbling apologies in the broken Spanish he'd picked up working construction during college. But Maria had seen something in his eyes, not the entitled arrogance of wealthy men's sons, but the desperate hunger of someone who understood poverty intimately, without saying a word. She'd begun leaving sandwiches wrapped in napkins near his workspace, small containers of her homemade soup, coffee that didn't taste like burned water. When his laptop died and he couldn't afford repairs, she'd quietly pressed $300, her entire month's grocery budget, into his hand. Para el futuro, she'd whispered. For the future, he'd tried to refuse, but she'd insisted with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that sometimes accepting help was harder than offering it. Richard had promised to pay her back. His eyes wet with tears he was too proud to shed. He never did pay her back. Not in money, but he'd built an empire. And Maria had told herself that watching him succeed was payment enough, even as that empire grew cold and calculating. Even as the young man's idealism hardened into ruthless pragmatism, she'd held on to the belief that somewhere inside the corporate titan, Patrick O'Sullivan's soul still flickered. Now, staring at these termination lists, Maria wondered if she'd been wrong all along. The sound of approaching footsteps sent her heart racing. She quickly refolded the documents, placing them exactly as she'd found them, and resumed her cleaning with practiced efficiency. But the names continued to echo in her mind like a funeral dirge. Roberto, Linda, Marcus, and hundreds of others whose only crime was being expendable in someone else's profit calculation. As she made her way back to the elevator, Maria caught her reflection in the polished surface of the building directory. The face that looked back was older than she remembered, marked by years of service and sacrifice. But the eyes, her mother's eyes, her grandmother's eyes, still held the fire that had carried her family across borders and through decades of struggle. Tomorrow, Richard Blackstone would sit in his glass tower and decide the fate of 400 families with the same casual efficiency he used to select his ties. He would forget that each name represented someone's everything, someone's reason for getting up before dawn and fighting through another day. But Maria would not forget. She had been silent for 20 years. invisible by choice and necessity. But silence, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as powerlessness. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, carrying her down toward the basement, where shadows gathered like old secrets waiting to be told. The executive conference room on the 40th floor existed in a state of perpetual winter. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of San Francisco Bay, but the glass seemed to leach warmth from everything it touched. The mahogany table stretched like a battlefield between opposing armies, its surface polished to mirror perfection, reflecting not just faces, but souls laid bare under the harsh fluorescent examination. Jennifer Walsh arrived first, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the staccato rhythm of approaching thunder. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through worst-case scenarios that all led to the same devastating conclusion. The coffee in her hands, her third cup of the morning, had gone cold hours ago, but she clutched it like a talisman against the storm she knew was coming. David Chen followed, his tablet loaded with spreadsheets that reduced human lives to data points. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes carried the hollow look of a man who'd learned to divorce emotion from mathematics. He'd run the numbers a dozen times, searching for alternatives that didn't exist, hoping for miracles that wouldn't come. The other executives filed in like mourners at a funeral they'd helped plan. Marcus Webb from operations, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by grim resignation. Sarah Kim from marketing, her designer suit armor against the carnage to come, and Thomas Bradley from legal, carrying contracts that would make the unthinkable legally bulletproof. But it was Richard's entrance that transformed the room's atmosphere from tense to electric. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who'd learned that showing weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his expression carved from stone, but Jennifer noticed the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands as he placed his portfolio on the table. "Good morning," Richard's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. "I trust you all understand why we're here." The question hung in the air, rhetorical but loaded with the weight of moral judgment. Jennifer felt her stomach clench as she realized this wasn't a discussion. It was a pronouncement. David cleared his throat, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a necessary amputation. "The board has mandated a 40% reduction in operational costs, given our current financial structure. That translates to approximately 400 positions across all departments. 400 people," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. 400 families. Richard's gray eyes fixed on her with laser intensity. 400 line items on a balance sheet, Jennifer. The sooner you understand that distinction, the easier this process will be. Easier for whom? The words escaped before Jennifer could stop them. Carrying 20 years of suppressed frustration with corporate doublespeak, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah studied her manicured nails with sudden fascination. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. "Easier for everyone involved," Richard replied, his tone suggesting that Jennifer's empathy was a character flaw rather than a virtue. "Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. These decisions require clarity of purpose, not emotional contamination." David activated his tablet, and the wall-mounted screen came alive with charts and graphs that painted human suffering in primary colors, productivity metrics, salary distributions, performance evaluations, all the data points that would determine who stayed and who disappeared. "I've organized the terminations by department and impact level," David continued, his voice growing more confident as he retreated into the safety of numbers. "We can minimize disruption by focusing on underperformers and redundant positions." Jennifer stared at the screen, watching names scroll past like credits at the end of a movie. But these weren't fictional characters. They were people she'd hired, trained, celebrated with during company parties, people who trusted her to protect their interests. "Roberto Jimenez," she read aloud. "Maintenance, 15 years of service, perfect attendance record. Overpaid for his skill level," Richard replied without hesitation. "We can outsource his responsibilities for 30% less." Linda Thompson, accounting, single mother, just got her daughter into a special needs program. Redundant since we automated the receivables process. Marcus Washington, its support, engaged, wedding planned for next month. Entry-level position. We can train a college intern for half his salary. With each name, Jennifer felt something inside her breaking. Not just her heart, but her faith in the system she'd spent her career serving. These people weren't statistics. They were the beating heart of TechVision Corp., the human machinery that transformed Richard's vision into reality. "Stop," she whispered. Then louder, "Just stop." Richard's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of the humanity he'd buried beneath years of corporate conditioning. "Stop what, Jennifer?" "This." She gestured at the screen, at the charts, at the casual cruelty of reducing lives to profit margins. "This isn't business. This is butchery." The silence that followed was deafening. David's fingers hovered over his tablet like a pianist frozen mid-performance. Marcus stared at the table as if the grain pattern might offer absolution. Sarah's breathing became audible, quick and shallow. Richard stood slowly, his movement deliberate and predatory. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Let me be very clear about something, Jennifer. This company exists to generate returns for our shareholders. Every decision we make, every breath we take, every thought we think should serve that single purpose. The moment we start prioritizing individual comfort over corporate survival, we become irrelevant." He began pacing around the table, his presence filling the room like toxic gas. "You think I enjoy this? You think I take pleasure in destroying lives? This is leadership, Jennifer. This is what separating emotion from necessity looks like. Is it?" Jennifer's voice shook with barely controlled fury. "Or is this what happens when we forget that the people we're destroying are the same people who built everything we claim to own?" Richard stopped directly behind her chair, his proximity a subtle intimidation tactic she'd seen him use countless times. "Those people are replaceable, Jennifer, every single one of them. But if this company fails because we were too weak to make hard choices, everyone loses their jobs. Is that what you want? Universal destruction in service of your conscience?" Jennifer turned to face him, her brown eyes blazing with righteous anger. "What I want is to remember that we're supposed to be better than this, that success doesn't have to come at the cost of our souls. Souls don't pay dividends," Richard replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "And frankly, Jennifer, if you can't stomach the realities of modern business, perhaps you should consider whether you're in the right profession." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Jennifer felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, waiting to see if she would bend or break under Richard's pressure. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of the building's ventilation system and the distant hum of traffic 40 floors below. Then David's tablet chimed with an incoming message, breaking the spell. But the damage was done. The line had been drawn, and everyone in the room understood which side they were expected to occupy. As the meeting continued, as the death sentences were pronounced with corporate efficiency, none of them noticed the gentle sound of a cleaning cart being wheeled down the hallway outside. None of them saw Maria Santos pause at the conference room door, her hand hovering over the handle as she listened to the casual destruction of everything she'd spent 20 years helping to build. But tomorrow, they would all learn that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the person nobody notices listening. The cleaning cart's wheels whispered against the marble floor like a prayer being spoken in an empty cathedral. Maria Santos moved through the aftermath of the morning's executive meeting, her presence as familiar and unremarkable as breathing itself. The conference room reeked of expensive cologne and moral bankruptcy, the lingering scent of decisions that would shatter lives with surgical precision. She began her work with the methodical patience of someone who understood that every surface held secrets. Every discarded paper told a story. The executives had left behind their usual debris, empty coffee cups bearing lipstick stains like accusations, crumpled napkins that had absorbed nervous sweat, and a single sheet of paper that had fluttered under the massive conference table like a wounded bird. Maria knelt to retrieve it, her aging joints protesting the movement. The letterhead made her stomach clench. Termination schedule. Phase 1. Below it, names arranged in neat columns. A butcher's inventory of human dreams about to be slaughtered. But it wasn't the names that stopped her breath. It was the annotation in Richard's handwriting at the bottom. Begin immediately. No exceptions. No mercy. No mercy. The words echoed in her mind as she continued cleaning. Each motion automatic, while her thoughts spiraled into memories she'd kept carefully buried. 20 years of watching, listening, serving in silence while the empire above her head grew cold and calculating. 20 years of believing that her invisibility was a form of protection, that staying small and quiet would keep her family safe. The sound of approaching voices froze her in place. Through the glass walls, she could see Richard returning with Jennifer Walsh, their body language screaming of unfinished business. Maria quickly stuffed the paper into her cart and resumed polishing the table, becoming part of the furniture, present but unnoticed, essential but ignored. Can't expect me to simply accept this. Jennifer was saying as they entered, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Richard closed the door with deliberate calm, the soft click somehow more ominous than a slam. I don't expect anything from you, Jennifer. I'm telling you how this is going to proceed. Maria kept her head down, her movements steady as she worked around them. In their minds, she was invisible, just another piece of the building's infrastructure, no more worthy of consideration than the ventilation system or the elevator mechanics. 400 people, Richard. 400 families who trusted us to what? Richard's voice carried the sharp edge of a man whose patience had been exhausted. To guarantee their employment regardless of market conditions, to prioritize their comfort over corporate survival. That's not trust, Jennifer. That's naive entitlement. Maria's hands stilled on the conference table's surface. She could feel the tension radiating from both of them, could smell the fear beneath Jennifer's perfume, and the desperate control beneath Richard's cologne. But there was something else in the air, something that reminded her of the scared young man she'd found sleeping in his office 15 years ago. This isn't who you used to be, Jennifer whispered, and Maria felt her heart skip a beat. Someone else remembered. Someone else had seen glimpses of the man before the machine. Richard's laugh was hollow, like wind through broken glass. Who I used to be was weak, ineffective, too concerned with being liked to be respected. I learned from those mistakes. You learned to be cruel. I learned to be necessary. The silence stretched between them like a chasm too wide to bridge. Maria continued her work, but every nerve in her body was attuned to the conversation, to the pain bleeding through their professional facades. Finally, Jennifer spoke again, her voice small and defeated. What happened to you? What happened to the man who started this company to democratize technology and elevate human potential? Richard turned toward the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. He grew up. He learned that idealism is a luxury you can only afford until reality kicks in the door. This company exists in a world where compassion is weakness and sentiment is suicide. I adapted. You surrendered. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Maria watched Richard's shoulders tense, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might explode, might finally release the pressure that had been building inside him like steam in a sealed vessel. Instead, he spoke with deadly quiet. If you can't support the decisions necessary for this company's survival, then perhaps your position here needs to be reevaluated as well. Jennifer's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. Maria felt her own chest tighten in sympathy. She'd seen this before. Richard's tactical deployment of fear as a management tool, his willingness to destroy anyone who challenged his authority. Are you threatening me? I'm clarifying expectations. Richard turned back to face her, his expression carved from stone. You work for Tech Vision Corp, not for the people we employ. Your loyalty belongs to this company's shareholders, not to your personal moral compass. If you can't accept that reality, then perhaps this isn't the right environment for you. Maria couldn't stay silent anymore. The words rose from her chest like pressure escaping a valve, spoken before her mind could silence them. Perhaps the environment is wrong for everyone. Both executives spun toward her, as if she'd materialized from thin air. In their 20 years of shared space, Maria had never spoken unbidden, never inserted herself into their corporate theater. She'd been the perfect invisible servant, present but voiceless, essential but unacknowledged. Now she stood with a cleaning cloth in her hands and fire in her eyes, no longer willing to pretend she couldn't see the moral devastation unfolding around her. Richard's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally cold dismissal. Excuse me. Maria straightened to her full height, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, and met his gaze directly. I said, perhaps the environment is wrong for everyone, including you. The silence that followed was electric, charged with the sudden recognition that the established order had just been challenged by someone who wasn't supposed to have a voice at all. You're out of line, Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Return to your duties. But Maria didn't move. 20 years of silence had been broken, and she found herself unable to retreat back into invisibility. My duties include cleaning up messes, Mr. Blackstone, and this. She gestured at the papers scattered across the table, at the toxic atmosphere poisoning the room. This is the biggest mess I've ever seen. Jennifer stared at her with something approaching awe. Never in her decade at Tech Vision had she seen anyone challenge Richard so directly, so fearlessly. The cleaning lady, whose name she was ashamed to realize she didn't even know, was doing what she herself hadn't had the courage to do, Richard's face darkened like a storm front approaching shore. "You're fired. Collect your things and leave immediately." Maria tilted her head, studying him with the patient attention of someone who'd been watching from the shadows for 2 decades. "Am I? Are you sure about that?" "Mr. Blackstone, are you sure you have the authority to fire me?" Something in her tone, a quiet confidence that seemed utterly at odds with her position, made Richard pause. Jennifer leaned forward, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite understand. "What did you say?" Maria smiled then, an expression that transformed her weathered face with unexpected warmth. "I said I've been watching you for a very long time. Patrick O'Sullivan, and I think it's time we had a conversation about the past." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. No one called him Patrick anymore. No one alive even remembered that name. That young man who died somewhere between ambition and achievement. But this small woman with calloused hands and knowing eyes had just resurrected a ghost he'd thought safely buried. And suddenly, looking at her, really looking at her for the first time in years, Richard began to remember something he'd fought desperately to forget. The name Patrick O'Sullivan hung in the air like smoke from a long-extinguished fire, carrying with it the scent of memories Richard had spent 15 years trying to burn. He felt his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack, hairline fractures spreading through the armor he'd forged from ambition and necessity. Maria Santos stood before him, no longer the invisible cleaning woman, but something far more dangerous, a witness to his transformation, a keeper of secrets he'd convinced himself were safely buried. Her dark eyes held the kind of knowing that comes only from watching someone's soul slowly die. "You remember me now, don't you?" Maria's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak truth to power. "You remember the nights when you slept on that old couch in what used to be Conference Room B, back when this company was just a dream and a prayer?" Jennifer Walsh felt the air in the room shift, as if she'd suddenly found herself witnessing an exorcism. The confident, ruthless CEO she'd known for years seemed to be shrinking before her eyes, his corporate polish dissolving like watercolors in rain. Richard's throat felt raw, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. How do I remember?" Maria smiled. But there was sadness in it, the melancholy of someone watching a beloved child become a stranger. "How could I forget? You were so young then, so full of fire, so certain you were going to change the world." The memories came flooding back against Richard's will, breaching the dam he'd built to contain them. Suddenly he was 27 again, broke and desperate, surviving on vending machine coffee and the relentless belief that his revolutionary software would democratize technology. He'd been living in his beat-up Honda Civic, showering at the YMCA, and sneaking into the building after hours to work on code that would either save him or destroy him. November 15th, 2009, Maria continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller sharing a treasured family legend. "It was raining so hard that night, the kind of San Francisco rain that cuts right through to your bones. You'd been working for 18 hours straight and you just collapsed." Richard's hands began to tremble. He could feel Jennifer's eyes on him, could sense her struggle to reconcile this story with the man she thought she knew. But Maria's words were pulling him back through time, stripping away layers of carefully constructed identity like paint being sandblasted from a wall. "I found you around 2 a.m, Maria continued. "Curled up on that ugly brown couch that was older than God himself. You looked like a lost child, Patrick. So thin I could see your ribs through your t-shirt. When was the last time you'd eaten a real meal?" The question pierced through Richard's defenses like a sword through silk. He remembered the gnawing hunger, the way his stomach had cramped from surviving on protein bars and desperate hope. He remembered the shame of being discovered, the way he'd tried to explain that he wasn't homeless, just temporarily displaced. "You didn't judge me," he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Everyone else saw failure, but I saw potential," Maria finished. "I saw a young man who cared so much about changing the world that he was willing to sacrifice everything for it." "Including himself?" Jennifer leaned forward, transfixed by this glimpse into Richard's hidden history. She'd always wondered about his origin story, the mythology that surrounded TechVision's founding. The official version spoke of innovative vision and calculated risks, but this was raw humanity, the kind of desperate vulnerability that created either monsters or miracles. "You started bringing me food," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger as the memories took hold. "Sandwiches wrapped in napkins, soup in containers you'd wash and reuse, coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of burned water." Maria nodded, her eyes growing misty with the weight of shared history. "My grandmother's chicken soup. She used to say it could heal anything. Broken bones, broken hearts, broken dreams. I thought maybe it could heal whatever was driving you so hard you forgot to take care of yourself. It wasn't just the food. Richard's facade was crumbling completely now, revealing glimpses of the idealistic young man beneath. You'd stay sometimes. After your shift, we'd talk about the software, about what it could mean for people who couldn't afford enterprise-level technology. You understood the vision in a way that nobody else did. Because I'd lived it, Maria replied simply. I knew what it was like to be locked out of opportunities because you couldn't afford the key. When you talked about democratizing technology, I saw my children's futures getting brighter. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of transformation and loss. Jennifer found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sound might shatter this moment of vulnerability and send Richard retreating back behind his corporate armor. What happened to him? Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to the young man who cried when his laptop crashed because he couldn't afford to lose 3 months of work? The one who said he'd rather fail trying to change the world than succeed at maintaining the status quo? Richard turned toward the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Outside, San Francisco sparkled in the afternoon sun, a city of dreams and broken promises. He learned that changing the world requires compromise, that idealism is a luxury you abandon when survival is at stake. No, Maria said firmly, and the authority in her voice made both Richard and Jennifer turn to look at her. He learned to be afraid. He learned that it's easier to become the thing you once fought against than to keep fighting for what you believed in. You don't understand the pressure, don't I? Maria's voice carried an edge now, the steel that had sustained her through decades of invisibility and struggle. You think I don't understand pressure? You think I don't know what it's like to make impossible choices to keep your family alive? She began walking around the conference table, her movement transforming the space from corporate boardroom to confessional. Let me tell you about pressure, Patrick. Pressure is working 3 jobs to pay for your daughter's medical treatments. Pressure is choosing between groceries and electricity. Pressure is watching your son get rejected from colleges because you can't afford the application fees. Richard felt each word like a physical blow. This woman had faced pressures he'd never imagined, had made sacrifices that dwarfed his corporate struggles, and yet she'd maintained her humanity while he'd lost his. But you know what the difference is? Maria stopped directly in front of him, her small frame somehow commanding the entire room. I never convinced myself that cruelty was necessity. I never decided that other people's suffering was the price of my success. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Maria's voice rose, carrying 20 years of suppressed frustration and disappointment. You've forgotten who you are, Patrick O'Sullivan. You've forgotten that every person in this building, every janitor, every secretary, every programmer, is someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's hope for a better future. Jennifer felt tears threatening as she watched this tiny woman dismantle the most powerful man she'd ever known with nothing but truth and memory. This wasn't just about corporate restructuring anymore. This was about the cost of forgetting your own humanity. The man I helped 15 years ago would never casually destroy 400 families to satisfy shareholders he's never met. That man understood that true success isn't measured in stock prices or profit margins. It's measured in the lives you lift up, not the ones you step on. Richard's breathing had become labored, as if the weight of his transformation was physically crushing him. When he spoke, his voice cracked like a teenager's. That man was naive. He would have failed. That man would have found another way. Maria reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out something that made Richard's blood freeze in his veins. A small, worn journal he'd thought lost years ago. That man wrote in here every night about building something beautiful, something that would honor the dignity of everyone it touched. She opened the journal to a page marked with a faded bookmark, her voice taking on the reverence of someone reading scripture. Technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. Every line of code we write, every decision we make, should ask the same question. Does this make the world more just, more compassionate, more connected? If the answer is no, then we're building the wrong thing. The words hung in the air like an indictment, the idealistic dreams of a young man confronting the corporate reality of what he'd become. Richard stared at the journal as if it contained the bones of his better self, evidence of a murder he'd committed so gradually, he'd barely noticed the victim dying. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his moral compromise, Patrick O'Sullivan began to remember what it felt like to have a soul. The journal trembled in Maria's weathered hands like a sacred text being revealed to heretics. Richard stared at his own handwriting. Younger, more hopeful, innocent of the compromises that would eventually consume the man who'd penned those idealistic words. The silence in the conference room had weight, pressing down on all three of them like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. Jennifer found herself leaning forward, drawn into this archaeological excavation of Richard's buried conscience. She'd worked alongside him for a decade, had seen him make ruthless decisions with surgical precision, but this glimpse of his former self was rewriting everything she thought she knew about the man who'd become a corporate legend. "That's not all I kept," Maria said softly, her voice carrying the gravity of someone about to reveal a long-held secret. From the depths of her cleaning cart, she withdrew something that made Richard's face drain of all color, a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had grown brittle over the years. The envelope bore his name in his own handwriting, Patrick O'Sullivan, Partnership Agreement, Tech Vision Ventures. Below it, a date that felt like a lifetime ago, December 3rd, 2009. Richard's knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the edge of the conference table for support. "Where did you get that?" "You gave it to me," Maria replied, her fingers tracing the faded ink with reverent care. "December 3rd, 2009. Do you remember what happened that night?" "Patrick." The memories crashed over him like a tsunami of suppressed emotion. December 3rd, the night his prototype had finally worked. The night he'd realized his software could actually change the world. The night he'd also realized he was completely, utterly broke, and couldn't afford to file the patents that would protect his creation. "You were crying," Maria continued, her voice growing softer as she retreated into memory. "Not just tears of joy from the breakthrough, but tears of desperation. You told me you had 48 hours to raise $50,000 for patent filings and legal fees, or someone else would steal your life's work." Jennifer watched Richard's face cycle through emotions she'd never seen him display: vulnerability, fear, and something that looked almost like grief. This wasn't the imposing CEO who'd terrorized boardrooms and destroyed careers with casual efficiency. This was a broken man confronting the ghost of his better self. "I remember," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was going to give up after 3 years of work. I was ready to walk away because I couldn't afford to protect what I'd built." Maria opened the envelope with deliberate care, as if handling archaeological evidence of a lost civilization. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the text typed on an old manual typewriter with keys that stuck occasionally, but the signatures at the bottom were clear and legally binding. "You offered me 30% of your company," Maria said, holding the document so both Richard and Jennifer could see it. "Not because you wanted to, but because you were desperate, and I was the only person who believed in your dream enough to help." The paper felt ancient in Richard's trembling hands as he read words he'd written in desperation 15 years ago. "In exchange for emergency funding to secure patent protection for the Tech Vision software platform, I, Patrick Sean O'Sullivan, hereby grant Maria Elena Santos 30% ownership of Tech Vision Ventures and all associated intellectual properties, with full voting rights and profit participation in perpetuity." Below his signature, in Maria's careful handwriting, was a note that stopped his heart. "Para el futuro," for the future. MS. Jennifer's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. 30%, Maria? Do you understand what this means? With Tech Vision's current valuation? It means Maria Santos is worth approximately $3.6 billion. Richard finished, his voice hollow with disbelief. "It means she's been one of the largest shareholders in Tech Vision Corp for 15 years, and I completely forgot." The confession hung in the air like an indictment. How do you forget owing someone your entire empire? How do you erase from memory the person who literally saved your life's work? Maria folded the document carefully, her movements deliberate and sad. "You didn't forget, Patrick. You chose to forget. There's a difference. But why?" Jennifer's question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why didn't you ever claim what was rightfully yours? Why did you stay invisible all these years?" Maria smiled, and in that expression, Jennifer saw depths of wisdom earned through decades of watching, listening, and understanding human nature in ways that business school could never teach. "Because I didn't want the money," Maria said simply. "I wanted to see what he would become. I wanted to believe that the young man who cried over losing his laptop because it contained code that could help people, that man would remember why he started this journey." She walked to the window, her small frame silhouetted against the sprawling city below. "I've been watching for 15 years, Patrick. watching you transform from someone who saw technology as a tool for liberation into someone who uses it as a weapon for oppression. I kept hoping that somewhere inside the corporate machine you'd built, the idealistic boy from Oakland still existed. Richard felt something breaking inside his chest. Not his heart, but the calcified shell he'd built around it. "Maria, do you know what I've done with my share of the dividends all these years?" she interrupted, turning back to face him. "The money that should have made me wealthy beyond imagination." Richard shook his head, afraid of the answer. "I created scholarship funds, anonymous donations to families who couldn't afford medical treatments, down payments for first-time homebuyers in East Oakland, college tuition for kids who reminded me of the young man you used to be." Her voice grew stronger with each revelation. "I've been using your company's profits to do what you once promised it would do, lift people up instead of grinding them down." The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized she was witnessing either the most beautiful or most tragic story she'd ever heard. Possibly both. $3.6 billion, Richard repeated, his voice cracking. "You gave away $3.6 billion. "No," Maria said firmly. "I invested it. In people instead of stock prices. In communities instead of corporations. In the future you once believed in, instead of the one you chose to build." She returned to the conference table, placing both hands flat on its polished surface. "But now I need that legal authority, Patrick, because the man I helped create is about to destroy 400 families, and I can't stand by silently anymore." Richard stared at the partnership agreement in his hands, a document that could legally challenge every decision he'd made in the past 15 years. Maria Santos wasn't just a cleaning lady with moral authority. She was a major shareholder with the legal right to demand explanations, to call votes, to fundamentally reshape the company's direction. "What do you want?" he asked. Though he already knew the answer would change everything, Maria's smile was sad, but determined. "I want you to remember who you used to be, Patrick O'Sullivan. I want you to remember that true leadership means protecting the people who trust you, not sacrificing them for profit margins." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "And if you can't remember, then maybe it's time for someone who hasn't forgotten to make the decisions that need to be made." The gauntlet had been thrown. In the space of 15 minutes, Maria Santos had transformed from invisible servant to the most powerful person in the room. The question now was whether Richard Blackstone would fight her for control of the empire they'd built together, or whether Patrick O'Sullivan would finally find the courage to come home. The partnership agreement lay on the conference table like evidence of a crime that had taken 15 years to solve. Richard Blackstone, or perhaps Patrick O'Sullivan. It was becoming difficult to tell the difference. Stared at the document that had just rewritten the entire power structure of his empire. His breathing had become shallow, rapid, the kind of hyperventilation that comes when your entire reality shifts beneath your feet. Jennifer Walsh felt as if she were watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Each revelation Maria had shared systematically destroying the foundations of everything she thought she knew about Tech Vision Corp. The cleaning lady, no, the major shareholder, stood quietly by the window, allowing the magnitude of her disclosure to settle like radioactive dust. 30%, Richard repeated, his voice hollow as an empty grave. "For 15 years you've owned 30% of my company, and you never said a word." "It was never your company, Patrick," Maria replied gently. "It was always our company. You just forgot that partnership means sharing both the burden and the responsibility." The words hit him like physical blows. Richard's legs gave out completely, and he sank into the nearest chair, his head falling into his hands. The perfectly styled hair that cost more than most people's monthly salary fell across his fingers in disheveled strands. And for the first time in years he looked his age. Vulnerable, exhausted, human. "You don't understand," he whispered through his fingers. "The pressure, the expectations, the board of directors breathing down my neck every quarter. I had to make impossible choices." "No," Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades watching those choices destroy lives. "You chose to make the easy choices. You chose to sacrifice other people instead of fighting for them. You chose to become the kind of man who measures success by how much suffering you can cause without feeling guilty about it." Jennifer found herself caught between fascination and horror as she watched the most powerful man she'd ever known crumble before her eyes. But there was something else happening here, something that felt less like destruction and more like excavation. as if Maria were carefully removing layers of accumulated cynicism to reveal whatever remained of the idealistic young man beneath. The conference room door burst open without warning, and David Chen strode in with his tablet clutched like a shield against uncertainty. Behind him came the other members of the executive committee, their faces bearing the careful neutrality of people who sensed blood in the water, but weren't sure whose blood it was. "Richard, we need to discuss the timeline for—" David stopped mid-sentence as he took in the scene. Their unshakable CEO slumped in defeat, the usually composed hater director with tears streaming down her cheeks, and the cleaning lady standing by the window with an air of quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire room. "What's going on here?" Marcus Webb from operations demanded, his jovial demeanor replaced by the sharp wariness of a man who'd survived 3 corporate restructurings by reading the political winds. Maria turned from the window, and the executives suddenly found themselves the focus of those dark, knowing eyes that had watched them all for years, without them ever truly seeing her. "I think it's time you all knew the truth about who really owns this company." Sarah Kim from marketing actually laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that died quickly when she realized no one else was joining her. "What are you talking about? Richard owns TechVision." "Richard owns 67% of TechVision," Maria corrected, holding up the partnership agreement. "I own 30%. The remaining 3% is divided among various smaller investors who've never bothered to vote their shares." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the whisper of the building's ventilation system. David's tablet slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the marble floor like dice thrown by fate. "That's impossible," Thomas Bradley from legal sputtered, his usually precise diction dissolving into confused stammering. "I've reviewed all the ownership documents. There's no record of any such agreement." Maria smiled, and there was something almost maternal in her expression, the patient tolerance of someone explaining a simple concept to children who'd convinced themselves they were adults. "Did you review the founding documents, Thomas? The original partnership agreements filed in December 2009, or did you only look at the corporate restructuring paperwork from when TechVision went public?" Thomas's face went pale as the implications hit him. Corporate lawyers, even good ones, often focused on recent filings when conducting due diligence. If Maria's agreement predated the public offering, "My God," he whispered, "if this is legitimate, it would take precedence over all subsequent organizational changes. The original partnership agreement would supersede everything else." Maria nodded approvingly, as if a slow student had finally grasped a fundamental concept. "Very good, Thomas. And as a 30% stakeholder, I have the legal right to call for emergency votes on major corporate decisions, including," she turned to look directly at Richard, "decisions that would materially affect the welfare of our employees." The executive committee exchanged glances that communicated volumes of panic and confusion. David cleared his throat nervously. "Are you saying you want to block the workforce reduction initiative?" "I'm saying I want to understand why we're choosing to destroy 400 families instead of exploring alternatives that might preserve both jobs and profitability." Maria's voice remained calm, but steel ran through it like rebar through concrete. "I'm saying that for 15 years, I've watched this company grow wealthy while forgetting the values that made that wealth possible." Richard finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "Maria, you don't understand the market pressures we're facing. The board of directors won't accept anything less than—" "The board of directors." Maria's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Patrick, do you know what 30% ownership means in terms of board representation?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as the full implications of Maria's revelation began to cascade through his consciousness. "It means," Thomas said slowly, his legal training finally catching up with the situation, "that Maria has the right to appoint 3 members to our 9-person board. It means she's had voting control over major corporate decisions for 15 years. And we've been operating under the assumption that she didn't exist." Sarah Kim sank into a chair, as if her legs had suddenly forgotten how to support her weight. "Jesus Christ. We've been making decisions about a company we don't actually control." Maria walked around the conference table, her presence transforming the space from a corporate boardroom into something that felt more like a courtroom, where final judgments were being rendered. "I never wanted to control anything. I wanted to trust that the young man I helped would remember why he started this company. I wanted to believe that success wouldn't cost him his soul." She stopped directly in front of Richard, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "But I can't stand by anymore. Patrick, I can't watch you become everything you once fought against. I can't let you destroy the lives of people I've watched grow and struggle and hope for 20 years. Richard looked up at her, and for a moment, Jennifer saw not the corporate titan, but a lost child, seeking forgiveness from a disappointed parent. What do you want me to do? I want you to remember, Maria said simply. I want you to remember that true leadership means lifting people up, not tearing them down. I want you to remember that the measure of a man isn't how much wealth he can accumulate, but how much good he can do with the power he's been given. The conference room had become a confessional, with 15 years of moral compromise being laid bare under the fluorescent lights, and somewhere in the building's depths, 400 employees continued their work, unaware that their fates were being decided by a woman they'd never noticed, and a man who was finally being forced to confront the cost of forgetting who he used to be. The silence in the conference room stretched like a held breath, fragile and electric with possibility. Richard Blackstone sat hunched in his chair, the weight of 15 years of moral compromise pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Around the table, his executive committee watched with the fascination of spectators at a public execution, uncertain whether they were witnessing the death of their CEO's career or the birth of something entirely unprecedented. Maria Santos remained standing, her weathered hands resting on the partnership agreement that had just rewritten the power dynamics of a $12 billion empire in the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked less like a cleaning lady and more like what she'd always been, a guardian angel watching over dreams that had lost their way. I need a moment, Richard finally whispered, his voice cracked and raw. I can't think clearly. Of course you can't, Maria replied with unexpected gentleness. You've been running from yourself for so long. You've forgotten what it feels like to stand still and listen to your own conscience. David Chen cleared his throat nervously, his financial mind struggling to process the implications of what they'd just learned. Maria, I need to ask, what exactly are your intentions here? Are you planning to exercise your ownership rights to what? Maria turned to face him, her dark eyes holding depths of wisdom that made his MBA suddenly feel like kindergarten arithmetic. To destroy what we've built, to tear down 15 years of work out of spite or revenge. She shook her head slowly. Sadly, David, I've spent 2 decades watching this company grow. I've seen young programmers become senior developers, watched administrative assistants work their way up to management positions, celebrated when the security guard's daughter graduated from college with tuition assistance from our employee education fund. This company is more than stock prices and profit margins. It's a community of people building their lives around the belief that their work matters. Thomas Bradley, still reeling from his legal oversight, managed to find his voice. But the board's mandate for cost reduction, they're not going to simply accept a reversal of strategy because a cleaning lady told them to. Maria's smile held both humor and steel. Thomas, I think you're still not understanding the situation. I don't need the board to accept anything. With 30% ownership, I can demand an emergency shareholder vote on any major corporate decision. And given that most of the smaller shareholders are pension funds and ethical investment groups, how do you think they'll vote when presented with evidence that there are alternatives to mass layoffs? The implications crashed over the executives like a tsunami. Jennifer Walsh felt her heart beginning to race as she realized what Maria was suggesting. Not just blocking the layoffs, but potentially restructuring the entire corporate governance of TechVision Corp. Richard raised his head, his face pale, but his eyes beginning to show sparks of something that might have been hope, or might have been terror. Maria, if you force a shareholder vote challenging the board's authority, it could trigger a complete corporate revolt. Harrison Whitfield and his allies will fight back with everything they have. Let them fight, Maria replied calmly. Patrick, do you remember what you wrote in that journal about building a company that could withstand storms? You said the strongest foundations are built on principles, not profit margins. It's time to test whether you were right. Sarah Kim from marketing leaned forward, her expression a mixture of admiration and panic. But the market reaction, if word gets out that we're prioritizing employee welfare over shareholder returns, our stock price could crash. And then what? Maria asked with genuine curiosity. The company disappears. The technology stops working. The customers abandon us because we chose to treat our employees with dignity, she began, walking around the table again, her movement transforming the space from corporate battlefield to something more intimate, a family meeting where hard truths were finally being spoken. I've been watching this industry for 20 years, Maria continued. I've seen companies obsess over quarterly earnings while their best people burned out and quit. I've watched brilliant innovations die because executives were too afraid of short-term volatility to invest in long-term vision. And you know what I've learned? She stopped behind Richard's chair, her hand hovering just above his shoulder. Not quite touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of human connection he'd forgotten he was capable of inspiring. The companies that succeed over decades aren't the ones that maximize quarterly profits. They're the ones that create environments where extraordinary people can do extraordinary work. They're the ones that understand that employee loyalty and innovation come from feeling valued, not from fear of unemployment. Jennifer felt tears threatening again as she recognized the truth in Maria's words. How many brilliant ideas had been stifled by the toxic atmosphere Richard had cultivated? How many potential innovations had been lost because people were too afraid of being fired to take creative risks? "I have a proposal," Maria said, finally placing her hand gently on Richard's shoulder. "A way forward that honors both the company's financial responsibilities and its moral obligations." Richard looked up at her, and for the first time in years, Jennifer saw vulnerability instead of calculated dominance in his eyes. "What are you suggesting?" Maria smiled, and in that expression was the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades observing human nature at its best and worst. Executive salary reduction, starting with the C-suite and working down through management. Voluntary early retirement packages for senior employees who might welcome the opportunity. Restructuring of redundant departments through retraining rather than termination. And most importantly, investment in the innovation and development programs you've been cutting for the past 5 years. David's mouth fell open. That would require a complete restructuring of our budget allocations. The board would accept it if presented as an alternative to a hostile takeover, Maria interrupted calmly, because that's what a forced shareholder vote would effectively become. I'm offering them a choice. Adapt to a more sustainable and humane business model, or face the possibility of losing control entirely. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This wasn't the quiet of defeat or shock. It was the quiet of minds racing through possibilities, of people beginning to imagine a different way forward. Richard turned in his chair to look directly at Maria, really seeing her for the first time in years. "You're asking me to risk everything I've built." "No, Patrick," she replied softly. "I'm asking you to save everything you built before it was buried under everything you became." He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, as if testing whether his legs would support not just his physical weight, but the weight of the decision he was contemplating. When he reached his full height, something in his posture had changed. Less corporate armor, more human presence. "If we do this," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day, "if we restructure around people instead of profit margins, there's no guarantee it will work. We could lose market share, face investor lawsuits, destroy everything we've accomplished." Maria nodded solemnly. "That's possible. But do you know what's guaranteed if we don't do this? 400 families destroyed, a company culture poisoned by fear and cruelty, and your transformation into exactly the kind of man your father warned you never to become." Richard closed his eyes, and in the silence that followed, everyone in the room could almost hear the sound of an old self dying and a new one struggling to be born. When he opened his eyes again, Patrick O'Sullivan was looking back at them. "Jennifer," he said, his voice carrying an authority born not from corporate hierarchy, but from moral conviction. "Cancel the termination orders. All of them. We're going to find a better way." 3 weeks after the conference room confrontation that had rewritten the DNA of TechVision Corp., Maria Santos walked through the building's corridors with a strange new sensation. Visibility. Employees who had passed her without acknowledgement for 20 years now nodded respectfully, some even stopping to thank her for changes they didn't fully understand but could feel in the very air they breathed. The transformation hadn't been smooth. Harrison Whitfield and 2 other board members had resigned in fury, threatening lawsuits that never materialized once their lawyers explained the legal validity of Maria's partnership agreement. The stock price had indeed dropped, 15% in the first week, before beginning a slow, steady climb, as investors realized that TechVision's revolutionary approach to employee retention was actually creating competitive advantages their rivals couldn't match. Maria pushed open the door to what had once been Conference Room B, the same room where she'd found a desperate young man sleeping on a decrepit couch 15 years ago. Now it housed the Employee Wellness Center, a space dedicated to counseling, career development, and family support services. The transformation was more than symbolic. It was a physical manifestation of the company's return to its founding values. "Mrs. Santos," a young voice called out, and Maria turned to see Rebecca Martinez, a customer service representative who'd been slated for termination in the original workforce reduction plan. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. My daughter starts kindergarten next month, and if I'd lost this job," Maria smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face with warmth that had sustained her through decades of struggle. "You don't need to thank me, Rebecca. You just need to keep being excellent at what you do. The company is stronger because of people like you." As Rebecca hurried away, Maria felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Patrick. She'd started thinking of him by his real name again. Standing in the doorway, the past 3 weeks had aged him, but in the way that honest labor ages someone rather than the way corruption does. The lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent restructuring budgets and difficult conversations with resistant executives, but his shoulders no longer carried the weight of moral compromise. "How are you settling into your new office?" he asked, gesturing toward the executive suite that had been prepared for Maria's official role as Chief People Officer, a position created specifically to give her the corporate authority to match her ownership rights. Maria laughed, a sound like silver bells in a gentle breeze. "Patrick, I've spent 20 years cleaning offices. Having one of my own still feels like wearing someone else's clothes." They walked together toward the elevator, their conversation easy in a way that would have been impossible during the years when corporate hierarchy had kept them in separate worlds. As they passed the reception desk, Margaret looked up from her computer and smiled, a genuine expression that Maria had never seen during the years when fear dominated the corporate culture. "The morning briefing is in 10 minutes, Margaret called out. "And Mrs. Santos, you have 3 more interview requests from business journals. Apparently, Harvard Business School wants to do a case study on our restructuring model." Maria shook her head in amazement. "A year ago, nobody knew I existed. Now they want to study me like a laboratory specimen. They want to study us," Patrick corrected as they entered the elevator. "What we've accomplished here, it's not just about changing corporate policies. It's about proving that companies can be profitable without being predatory." The elevator rose toward the executive floors, but the journey felt different now. The building's hierarchy hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed from a rigid caste system into something more organic. Levels of responsibility rather than levels of human worth. The morning briefing was held in the main conference room, the same space where Maria had confronted Patrick 3 weeks ago, but the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the toxic tension that had once characterized executive meetings, there was an energy of collaborative problem-solving that reminded Maria of the early days she'd witnessed when tech vision was still small enough for everyone to know everyone else's name. Jennifer Walsh looked up from her notes as they entered, her face carrying the glow of someone who'd rediscovered the joy in her work. "Patrick, Maria, perfect timing. I have updates on the restructuring initiatives." David Chen, who had initially resisted the new direction with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged, now presented financial projections with something approaching enthusiasm. "The voluntary early retirement program has been more successful than we projected. 63 senior employees have taken the packages, and we're using the savings to fund the retraining programs for displaced workers," Sarah Kim added. "Employee satisfaction scores have increased 40% in 3 weeks. More importantly, our innovation pipeline has exploded. When people stop worrying about arbitrary layoffs, they start focusing on creative solutions. We've received more viable product proposals in the past month than in the previous year combined." Maria settled into her chair at the conference table, positioned directly across from Patrick, symbolizing their partnership rather than any hierarchical arrangement. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating faces that no longer bore the careful neutrality of corporate survival, but the engaged expressions of people who believed their work mattered. "There have been challenges," Jennifer continued, her honesty reflecting the new culture of transparency they were building. 17 managers in mid-level positions have requested transfers to other companies. They're having difficulty adapting to a leadership style that emphasizes collaboration over intimidation. "Let them go," Patrick said without hesitation, his response carrying none of the cold calculation that had once characterized his decision-making. "We need leaders who inspire excellence, not fear. If they can't adapt to treating people with dignity, they're not the right fit for what we're building." Thomas Bradley cleared his throat nervously. "There's also the matter of the pending acquisition offer from Morrison Tech. They're offering 20% above market value, but their due diligence team is concerned about our new operating model." Maria and Patrick exchanged glances. a moment of silent communication that reflected the partnership they'd built over the past 3 weeks. "What kind of concerns?" Maria asked. "They're questioning whether our employee-centric approach is sustainable long-term. They've specifically mentioned that they would need to rationalize our workforce to align with their operational efficiency standards." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Morrison Tech was known for aggressive cost-cutting measures that typically resulted in massive layoffs within the first year of any acquisition. "Counter-proposal," Patrick said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd rediscovered his moral center. "We're not for sale, not to Morrison, not to anyone who views our employees as expendable resources rather than valuable assets." David's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Patrick, the offer represents a significant premium for shareholders." "David," Maria interrupted gently, "what good is a premium if it comes at the cost of destroying everything we're building? Money is a tool, not a destination. We're proving that companies can create both financial value and human value. Why would we abandon that experiment just as it's beginning to show results?" The conversation continued, covering budget reallocations, new hiring initiatives, and the development of innovative benefit programs that other companies were already beginning to copy. But beneath the operational details was something more profound: the recognition that they were participating in a fundamental reimagining of what corporate success could look like. As the meeting concluded and the executives dispersed to their various responsibilities, Maria remained behind with Patrick. Through the conference room windows, they could see employees arriving for their shifts, not with the resigned trudging of people resigned to corporate servitude, but with the purposeful energy of individuals who believed their contributions mattered. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Patrick asked, his question carrying the vulnerability of someone still learning to trust his own moral instincts. Maria smiled, her expression holding the wisdom of someone who'd watched dreams die and be reborn. "Patrick, 3 weeks ago you were prepared to destroy 400 families to satisfy shareholders you'd never met. Today you're building a company that proves profit and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. What do you think?" Outside, San Francisco sparkled in the morning sun, a city of dreams and second chances. And 40 floors below, in the building's depths where their journey had begun, a new generation of maintenance workers moved through the halls with dignity, knowing that their work was valued by a company that had remembered how to see the humanity in everyone who contributed to its success. 6 months after the revolution that began in a conference room with a cleaning cart and a forgotten document, Maria Santos stood at the podium of the San Francisco Convention Center, looking out at an audience of CEOs, business leaders, and journalists who had gathered to hear about the tech vision miracle. The irony wasn't lost on her. A woman who had spent 2 decades invisible was now being hailed as a visionary who had transformed corporate America's understanding of success. "People ask me," Maria began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium's advanced sound system, "how a cleaning lady became one of the most influential business leaders in the country, but I think they're asking the wrong question." The audience leaned forward, captivated by this small woman whose story had become legend in business schools and boardrooms across the nation. In the front row, Patrick O'Sullivan, he'd legally changed his name back 6 weeks ago, watched with the pride of someone witnessing a friend's well-deserved recognition. "The right question," Maria continued, "is how did we create a business culture where cleaning ladies become invisible in the first place? How did we build systems where the people who literally keep our companies running are treated as expendable resources rather than valuable human beings?" The silence in the auditorium was profound, the kind of quiet that comes when fundamental assumptions are being challenged by undeniable truth. 6 months ago, Tech Vision Corp was preparing to lay off 400 employees to improve quarterly profit margins. Today we employ 600 more people than we did then. Our productivity has increased 37%, and our stock price has reached an all-time high. But those numbers, impressive as they are, aren't what I'm here to talk about. Maria paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her, seeing not corporate titles or net worth, but human beings capable of choosing between cruelty and compassion. I'm here to talk about Roberto Jimenez, who was scheduled for termination, but instead became head of our new facilities innovation department. His proposals for energy-efficient building management have saved us over $2 million while creating a healthier work environment for everyone. I'm here to talk about Linda Thompson, whose intimate knowledge of our accounting inefficiencies, gained from 15 years of processing the paperwork we executives never bothered to examine, helped us streamline operations in ways that preserved jobs while improving performance. The audience stirred. recognizing names they'd never heard but stories they were beginning to understand. I'm here to talk about the revolutionary idea that the people closest to the work often have the best ideas for improving it, but only if we create environments where their voices can be heard and their contributions valued. Behind the podium, a massive screen displayed before and after statistics that told the story of TechVision's transformation in stark numerical terms. Employee satisfaction scores that had skyrocketed, innovation metrics that defied industry standards, profit margins that had grown even as executive salaries had been reduced, and worker benefits had been expanded. The business press calls what we've accomplished a miracle, Maria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. But there's nothing miraculous about treating people with dignity. There's nothing supernatural about recognizing that a company's greatest assets aren't its intellectual property or its market position. They're the human beings who transform ideas into reality every single day. In the audience, executives began pulling out their phones, not to check emails or texts, but to take notes, to record insights that challenged everything they thought they knew about corporate success. Patrick O'Sullivan and I didn't discover some secret formula for business success. We simply remembered something that corporate culture had trained us to forget, that every employee is someone's son or daughter, someone's hope for a better future, someone's reason for getting up each morning and fighting through another day. Maria's voice took on the cadence of a sermon, but she was preaching to a congregation of capitalists who were beginning to see profit and compassion, not as opposing forces, but as complementary energies. When we announced our restructuring plan, choosing investment in people over immediate cost reduction, our stock price dropped 15% in the first week. Our board of directors panicked. Our competitors predicted our imminent collapse. Industry analysts wrote obituaries for our naive idealism. She smiled, the expression radiating the quiet satisfaction of someone who had bet everything on human decency and watched it pay dividends beyond imagination. But something interesting happened during those first few weeks of uncertainty. Our employees, all of them, from janitors to senior developers, began working not just harder, but smarter. When people stop worrying about arbitrary termination, they start thinking creatively about improvement. When they believe their contributions matter, they contribute more than anyone thought possible. The screen behind her shifted to display innovation metrics that seemed to defy corporate logic. A 300% increase in employee-generated process improvements, a 450% surge in voluntary collaboration across departments, a 200% growth in employee referrals for open positions. Our customer satisfaction scores improved because employees who felt valued began treating customers like valued human beings rather than revenue sources. Our product development accelerated because engineers who weren't afraid of being fired for failed experiments began taking the creative risks that drive genuine innovation. Maria paused to take a sip of water, her gesture somehow managing to create suspense in an auditorium filled with people accustomed to controlling billion-dollar enterprises. But the most important change wasn't measurable in quarterly reports or stock prices. It was the transformation I witnessed in Patrick O'Sullivan, a man who had forgotten that true leadership means lifting others up, not grinding them down for personal advancement. She turned slightly to acknowledge Patrick in the front row, her smile carrying 20 years of shared history and hard-won wisdom. Patrick had built a successful company, but he'd lost his soul in the process. The young man who once wrote that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around, had become exactly the kind of leader he once would have fought against. But here's what I learned from watching his journey back to himself. Redemption isn't just possible, it's profitable. The audience erupted in applause. But Maria raised her hand for silence. She wasn't finished. The transformation of TechVision Corp isn't a feel-good story about corporate responsibility. It's a case study in competitive advantage. Companies that treat employees as disposable resources will always be vulnerable to companies that treat them as irreplaceable assets. Organizations that lead through fear will always be outperformed by organizations that lead through inspiration. She moved from behind the podium, walking closer to her audience, her presence filling the stage with the authority of someone who had earned the right to challenge conventional wisdom. I've spent my entire career watching businesses from the ground up. Literally, I've cleaned the offices where decisions are made, emptied the trash cans where failed ideas are discarded, and observed the human cost of treating quarterly earnings as more important than human dignity. And I'm here to tell you that there's a better way. The final slide appeared on the screen. TechVision's current valuation, employee count, and satisfaction metrics alongside a simple statement. True value isn't what you extract from people. It's what you help them become. 6 months ago, I was invisible. Today, Harvard Business School is writing case studies about our approach to corporate governance. But I'm not the miracle here. The miracle is what happens when you stop seeing employees as costs to be minimized and start seeing them as investments to be maximized. Maria returned to the podium, her presence somehow both humble and commanding. Patrick O'Sullivan learned that you can't lead people you don't respect, and you can't respect people you refuse to see. I learned that 20 years of silence doesn't diminish the power of your voice when you finally find the courage to use it. Together, we learned that the strongest companies aren't built on the destruction of human dignity. They're built on its elevation. The standing ovation began before she finished speaking, a thunderous acknowledgement that extended far beyond polite professional courtesy. In that applause was the recognition that fundamental change was possible, that corporate culture could evolve beyond the zero-sum thinking that had dominated business for decades. As the applause finally subsided, Maria offered her closing thought. The question isn't whether your company can afford to treat people with dignity. The question is whether it can afford not to. Later, as the conference wound down and executives clustered in small groups discussing implementation strategies and transformation timelines, Patrick found Maria on the convention center's balcony, looking out at the San Francisco skyline where their journey had begun. "Penny for your thoughts," he asked, joining her at the railing. Maria smiled, her eyes reflecting the city lights that sparkled like stars fallen to earth. "I was thinking about my grandmother's chicken soup. She always said it could heal anything. Broken bones, broken hearts, broken dreams. And now I think maybe she was right. Maybe what this whole industry needed was a little more grandmother's wisdom and a little less corporate strategy." They stood in comfortable silence. Two unlikely partners who had discovered that the most profitable investment a company could make was in the basic human decency of treating every person as if their dreams mattered. In the distance, the Tech Vision building rose against the night sky, its lights representing not just another corporate headquarters, but a beacon of possibility, proof that business could be both profitable and humane. The true value wasn't measured only in shareholder returns, but in the lives transformed by the belief that everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. The revolution that had begun with a cleaning cart and a forgotten partnership agreement had become something larger than either of them had imagined. Evidence that the future of business lay not in extracting value from human beings, but in recognizing the infinite value that human beings, when treated with dignity and respect, could create together.